Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today, as part of our Back to Basics series, we're going to be looking at quotes and how to build quotes and edit quotes, and we'll look at some quote reports and a few things like that. The first thing I always like to mention when we're talking about quotes is that if you are a new user in an existing Flex system, you very well might not see the name quotes in your system. That's because in Flex, all of these different elements are very customizable. If we look at our project element settings, you'll notice if we double click on quote, we could go in and actually change the name of the quote element. So by default, we call it a quote. When Flex is shipped to a new customer, we call it a quote. Most people keep that name, but if you don't see quote in your system, perhaps somebody at some point in the life of your Flex system has changed that name, maybe to something like proposal or estimate or whatever you might call that element. We're going to be calling it a quote though, because that's what it's called by default, and that's how it's set up in my system. So the quote is the basic financial element in Flex. The quote is going to be the element that you can put inventory on and different services and things like that so that you can charge or at least give an idea of what you're going to charge your customer. Before we even get into quotes, I just want to look at some of the principles behind pricing of your inventory and services, because that's a really important part of how quotes get built. So let's open just a random inventory item, like one of our speakers. Of course, I also could have gone up into the search tab and just searched for that item. But a lot of times I like to browse through my inventory tree. If we click on the pricing tab for this item, you'll notice a couple different fields. We have each pricing model, and we're not really going to look at those today, but these are some default ones that are set up in the system, and you could set up some custom ones if you want. But typically for rentals, you might be dealing with a day rate or a week rate. And I put as the price for my day rate $50. This is going to be what is charged to the customer when I put this item on a quote. And then my week rate is set up to be 3 times the day rate. You'll notice that once we start building a quote, how you can choose the different rates. You can either have a default rate that will be applied to every single quote whenever you start one, or you could change that rate for individual line items in a quote. You'll also notice the cost. This is a very different type of field. This isn't really the purchase or replacement cost for that item. That's a different field that you fill in when you're creating the inventory model. This cost is more of your internal cost for each time that you rent this item. And again, we'll look at this more as we start building a quote, but I might say it costs me $5 every time I send one of these items out. And that could be any number of things. That could be the cost of storing the item, so a small portion of whatever it costs to rent or upkeep the building that you store all your inventory. This could also be the cost of prepping that item or maintaining that item. So it's really up to you what you put into that field, but that cost really is just saying that is your own internal cost for this pricing model for each one of these that you will rent out. And we'll look at that a little bit more and how that gets all calculated and the different things you can use on a quote using both cost and price. Similarly with services, if you're putting different services like labor, show expenses, transportation, etc. onto a quote, you have those same fields. So for example, if we pull up a video switcher and look at the pricing, notice we have the pricing models, and this one has an extra one that I've enabled for service types, the hourly rate that wasn't available for inventory items. But over here I would put how much I charge for a video switcher. Maybe I do $500, and then the internal cost to me. This one might be a little bit more tricky to put on labor like this, because depending on who you hire, that cost could be very different. So a lot of times you might just leave that blank and hand enter those costs later. But you could at least put a default price that you typically charge. And maybe you pad that a little bit more, because you could pay a video switcher anywhere between $400 and $600, but then you pad that just a little bit more. That's what you charge to the customer, but your end bill for a day rate for that might only be $500 or $600. So again, that's up to you and how you do that. I just wanted to show you where those fields are, because those are very important when it comes to building a quote, and if you want default pricing to appear on your quote. So we'll close those down, and now let's actually get into the creation and editing of a quote. And we'll come back to some of those pricing and cost principles when we get there. The fastest and easiest way to create a quote is just go up into your New menu and click New Quote. Or again, if that has been changed in your system, you might be doing New Proposal, New Estimate, whatever you call the quote element in your system. Really, the only things that are required by default are going to be the ship and return date of the quote. These are really important dates because in Flex, the availability of your inventory is going to be based on the ship and return date of any quote that inventory appears on. So for example, if I say that the ship date of this is upcoming Friday, and then it's going to return Monday, maybe Monday morning, any piece of inventory that I put on this quote now, and after I go into a status that starts booking gear or creating conflicts, then that inventory is going to show as reserved between these dates. So that's why we have them required by default. You could turn that off. The dates don't have to be required, but by default, and most people keep that enabled in their system, the ship and return date are required. Everything else you see here is not actually required right now. So I don't even have to give it a name technically if I don't want to, but I'm going to. Let's call it webinar training. I'm not going to put a quote number in here either, because in Flex we actually have a default numbering scheme for quotes. So if I leave this blank, it's going to look at my system settings and whatever quote numbering scheme I have set up and automatically apply a quote number. And then look at all these other options that we have. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because most of them are self-explanatory. I will say a few things though. That number one, you might want to put in what is your default time. If you put nothing in here, all the inventory that you put on a quote will default to whatever the date range is between the ship and return. So right now I believe if I don't put a default time in here, it's going to say, well, I'm going to charge a 4-day rate. And same with the pricing model. I could say, well, which rate do I want to use by default? Every item that I put on this quote, do I want it to default to the day rate or the week rate? Or maybe I'm doing some retail items and I want to default it to each. I typically like to leave it at the day rate. I'm also not going to put in a default time because I want to show you some how you can bulk edit different line items too. So if I don't put in a default time, but then later down the road decide I'm only charging a single day rate, I could do that by bulk editing the quote after it's already been created. Again, not going to go through every single one of these fields, but some other important ones might be your client. You can either just start hand typing a name and it will give you a list of clients in your system to choose from, or you can click the binoculars icon. And then a venue, same thing. You could start typing in a venue or click binoculars, and that will give you the ability to search for or even add a new venue or contact, so you don't have to close down the quote window here. If you've implemented facilities in that venue, then that would give you the ability to enter a facility in there as well. These other date fields are really just there for informational purposes. This is not going to change the availability of any of your inventory. Again, the only dates that affect availability of inventory is ship and return dates. So the load-in date and show start and all of this stuff is really just there for informational purposes. Same with deposit due date, etc. All that stuff is just there for if you want that information to be there to reference so that you can see it, or anyone else who opens this quote in Flex will be able to see it as well. I'm not going to put anything into those fields. I'm just going to click accept. We're not going to look at deposits and that kind of stuff in this webinar, since this is more of a basic training on quotes. Really what we're going to look at is just how to start building this quote, good strategies for editing quotes, and things like that. Let's start just by looking at a few of the options over here in the quote menu. Notice first of all that most of the information I input shows up in the header here. I could click into many of these fields and change that information, whether it be dates or the warehouse that it's shipping from, client, etc. Or I could click this edit header, and that will pop up the original quote creation form where I could make changes there. I also have the ability to delete the quote, move the quote somewhere, and we're going to look at that near the end of this webinar, where you could create like an event folder where you have multiple quotes. You could copy the quote entirely, and then here's a few other options that we'll look at once we actually start adding lines to the quote. So let's do that now. Building a quote is just a simple matter of finding the inventory that you want to add. So let's just go with that item that we were looking at earlier. And you just drag and drop it onto the quote. Enter the quantity that you want to add and then click accept. Or you could hit enter. I pre-configured some suggestions for this inventory item. We're not really going to look at how to do that. If you want to learn more about suggestions, I have a few videos and webinars on our YouTube page. But these are just the pre-configured suggestions that I said, if I add that item to a quote, these are the things that I want to suggest. Let's say that I want to send some mics with it, some cable. Click accept, and it's going to add all those items for me. Now, this is a really important principle about quote building that I want to look at. Right now, you can see that as I'm dragging and dropping items, I can put them wherever I want on the quote. And you'll also notice that there's really no hierarchy or structure. It's just a big list of the items that I put on the quote. That's because I'm building this quote right now in what we call insert sort mode. That lets me drag and drop items wherever I want on a quote from any category. So I could even find some video cable, for example, and just drag and drop that in between my audio items. For a lot of people, that's not a very intuitive way to build a quote, and it doesn't really make it look that good either. There are some methods that you might use in insert sort mode, and we'll look at those in a few minutes. But what a lot of people do, and I'm going to delete these items really quick so I could show you the other method. What a lot of people do is they will use what we call auto sort mode. What auto sort mode does is when I drag and drop an inventory item onto a quote in auto sort mode, notice what happens. I'm going to ignore the suggestions this time, but look at what happens. That item goes into a category that's based on the parent inventory group that item belongs to. And once that's been created after dragging and dropping my first line item, watch what happens. I could drag over this Behringer. I could drag over some microphones. And you see, I don't have to be careful where I'm putting that item on the quote. I could just drag and drop it over quickly, and it automatically puts it into its respective subtotal. Notice too, when I drag and drop an item from video, it creates a new subtotal for video. See, I'm even dropping these items on top of the audio folder, but because I'm in auto sort mode, it puts them into the right subtotal. One thing that you will notice, I don't even know if I have any items in lighting, so that might not work. But one thing you'll notice is that the order that the subtotals appear on your quote is going to be the same order that your inventory groups are organized over here in the inventory tree. So a lot of times you want to strategically sort your groups over here, let's say that video is kind of more of your bread and butter stuff. So I want to move that above audio. So now, if I had a clean quote that I was starting from scratch, when I drag and drop video, that would be the first subtotal, then audio, then lighting, etc. So we always recommend trying to start with your bigger ticket items and then going down to smaller things like staging, truss, scenic stuff, whatever. Or maybe staging and truss are your bigger items, so you would put those at the top and audio and video appear lower, just so you can get items to appear higher up on the quote so your customers can see them. You could also, of course, use the search. So I come over here and maybe I say I want to add a couple different types of speakers. That kind of makes it a lot easier for you to add the items without having to go through the inventory tree. And it will still sort based on the auto sort mode hierarchy of the inventory groups. Now that we have some line items on the quote, let's look at the different things that appear in each line item. Number one, this box shows us what the availability of this line or of this item is based on the ship and return date. So what Flex is doing is it's going through the entire system, it's looking at other jobs that exist, and it's showing me whether or not I have enough available that I'm requesting based on any other job in the system. One important aspect of this is that any other quote that Flex is going to check has to be in either the confirmed or tentative state. Or at least if you've done some customization on your workflow, it has to be in some status that creates conflicts. That's the term that we use, creates conflicts, yes or no. So right now my quote is an inventory. I'm sorry, not inventory, an inquiry. So if I were to look at the schedule for one of these items, it's not going to show a dip in quantity that's available during the dates of this quote yet because it's still in the inquiry status. But if I go and change this to confirmed, watch what happens when I go reload this schedule. Now it's showing me I only have 12 available over this weekend because I'm using 2 on this quote. And then these numbers here are just showing us a quick view of that availability based on the warehouse that you're using. That's why my number is a little bit higher over here, because I'm showing the quantity that's available between all my warehouses. But since I'm quoting directly from my Salt Lake warehouse, this is only showing me how many I have available in Salt Lake City. So let's say I go up to 10. That's telling me now you're using all the available quantity and you have 0 left. If I say I need 12, now Flex is telling me that I have a conflict. And if I need to resolve that conflict, I just double click that conflict and it will show me all the different options that I have to resolve it. I could transfer it, I could subrent it, purchase some, or I could substitute it for another item entirely. And if you click through the different tabs up here, you can see why you have a conflict. This one's pretty easy. I only have 10 on hand. I'm requesting 12 for this job. So that's telling me that I'm requesting more than I actually have available. But this would also show me, let's say, for example, if I copy this quote for the same exact dates, and I have the same exact inventory on them, look at what happens to my availability numbers now. Because on this new quote that I just copied, even though it's still in the inquiry status, Flex is looking at the quantity I'm requesting on this quote alone, plus it's looking at this other quote that's in a confirmed status. And it's telling me you're looking for 12 of these, but based on the availability in your warehouse, plus the fact that you are requesting 12 on another job, that's how big your conflict's going to be. And you'll notice all of my conflict numbers changed for my other items too, because I have another job in the system that's requesting those same items. I don't have any conflicts yet, but if I start changing quantities, you can see those conflicts start popping up. So at this point, I have a few options. I could look at the conflict, see why I have a conflict, and maybe call the person who is doing that quote, the account manager who's doing this quote, and say, hey, can you use something else? Or you could say that you could use something else. Flex uses what we call, I guess we don't really have a technical term for it, but when there's a conflict in the system, it kind of turns into everybody's problem because all your inventory is coming from the same place. So you should figure out which job should get your inventory, which job might need to subrent it, which job might need to replace it with something else. We don't do a first come, first serve because there's too many business decisions that have to be made about conflicts. It's not necessarily whoever created the job first. It might have to do more with, well, which job is making us more money? Which job is a more important client? So that's why we do it that way, where the conflict will become everybody's problem, and you have to work as a team to resolve that. A few other things that we have in each row. Remember this time I said, because I didn't do a default time when I was creating the quote, it automatically defaulted to the days between the ship and return date. So everything is quoting at a 3-day rate. And you'll notice that the price extends to show that. So, for example, if I'm only requesting one of these speakers, I charge $45 for it, but at a 3-day rate, that extended price is $135. Like I mentioned earlier, let's say that somewhere during this process I decide the client's only using it for 2 days. So I'm only going to charge them a 2-day rate, but I've already built my quote. What I can do is come over here, select all line items, then come over here and click bulk edit and say I want to change the time for any line item I selected to 2. And that changes everything to 2. We're not going to go through all of them, but notice some of the other options in your bulk edit. You could change the resource type, quantities, the note line, which pricing model rate I'm using, etc. The last part of these line items is the mute boxes. So NM means note mute. That means if I were to type a note for this line item, maybe I don't want my client to see that, so I would hit note mute. And now when I go to generate a PDF of this quote, it's not going to show that note. If I hit price mute, Flex is still calculating this price, and it's still going to add it to the total. But when I generate that PDF, price mute is going to say, don't show the price for this line item to the client. I only want them to reference the total. So if I hit the header for price mute, then that would price mute all of the line items. Line mute is going to be, maybe I don't want the client to even see this entire line. I still want to charge for it, but they don't have to see every single line item. This is more applicable for items that have child line items. So like when I put this 450 speaker on a quote, it automatically added the IEC cable and the speaker case. Maybe I don't need my client to see those things, so those are line muted. And then total mute is actually going to take the price off of your grand total. So look at what happens. I'm at $998 right now. If I total mute this line item, it takes me down to $908. So that one does actually affect the price. But let's look at what this looks like now. I have a note mute, so it's not going to show this note. I have a price mute, so it's not going to show that price. And then I have a few items that are line muted. So when I hit generate PDF, it's going to look something like this. Some of the lines don't appear. And it looks like, or yeah, I actually did price mute on everything. So it's not showing the price, it's only showing the subtotals and the grand total. And then the note mute doesn't show the note. So that's what those mute boxes do. Some of the other options you have over here, you can copy and paste lines. So let's say I want to copy all these lines and then hit paste, and that will paste them onto the quote. Notice it pastes them down here out of a subtotal. I can use these little grabber dots that I like to call them, and drag and drop those anywhere I want onto the quote. We looked at bulk edit. We also have create subtotal. You can create your own custom subtotals that don't necessarily have to be named after your inventory groups. So let's delete these lines and kind of show you how you could do that from scratch. Let's say that I want to create a subtotal called Stage 1. Now what I have to do is go into Insert Sort mode, and I could start building all the items that go on that stage. I have to drag and drop it right into the subtotal though, so make sure that thick black line goes into the subtotal that you're trying to add the item. And I can even copy and paste subtotals. So I'll click on the cogwheel for the subtotal, hit copy line, and then come over here and say paste copied lines. And then say edit subtotal and change the name to stage 2. Because maybe you're doing 10 stages, but they all have similar, if not the same items. Another cool thing too is that if you add a bunch of line items using insert mode, and let's just do that really quick. We'll just add a few. If I want to add all these items to a subtotal, I could just select all. And when I create that subtotal, anything I have selected is automatically going to go into that subtotal. So just a nice quick way to add things into a subtotal if you already have them existing on a quote. We already looked at the workflow options. If you need to go back into inquiry, maybe the customer is changing their mind, you could reset it to inquiry so that this gear is no longer being booked on the schedule in Flex. You can update the pull sheet. We have different videos and webinars about that if you want to learn more about pull sheets. But then, of course, you could send this quote directly to a client right here in Flex. When I click Send a Client, it's going to take the email of my client, put together this message, and attach a PDF copy of the quote. So I could do that just right here in Flex. Or I could just hit Generate PDF, or any of the other quotes, and that would save one into on my computer, and then I could just email that or print it out and give it to my client. So there's quite a few other options here on the quote. We'll get into some of those in another webinar where we look at some more advanced stuff. Some of the things I just wanted to briefly look at before we finish, though, are the different tabs along the top. A lot of people don't realize that you can tab through and view different views of the quote. So this is a basic view that's going to show all the basic information about the line items. I could also look at logistics view. This is going to show me if I'm subrenting or transferring any of these items. The profit markup view. Remember, this is where the cost field for my inventory comes into play. If I had put things into this cost field, it would both show me how much money am I getting from the client, what am I charging them, but also how much is it costing me internally. So you can kind of do a profit markup look here and see how much of a markup you're making on that. We have a change view where you can look at who changed things on a quote last, when it was created and the last time it was modified. The warehouse view will show us the specific pickup and return dates, and if there's a different warehouse it might be coming from, you could change it there. Status changes will show any time that you change the status of the entire quote. Event history, job costing kind of does the same thing as the profit markup, just a different view. Notes that you can add to a quote, and if you apply a payment, you could view those here as well. So that is the basics behind quotes, how you can build quotes, edit quotes, and send your quotes out to your customers. Again, there's a lot more to this. There's a lot more best practices and different things that you can do with quotes and ways that you can modify the way that a quote looks, setting up defaults that will apply for system-wide or defaults that only apply to certain contacts. A lot of those things we'll cover in a later webinar. Some of them are available to you already on our YouTube page. You could look at our webinars about contacts. You could look at webinars about changing project element settings and things like that. But I just wanted to make sure that we go through and look at some of the basics of quote building, because I know that we've been getting a lot of new customers lately, and a lot of people are asking about some of these basic principles. So that's why we've been doing some of these webinars on going back to the basics. If you have some questions or if there's anything you want to discuss about quoting and things like that, I always recommend going to our forum. It's forum.flexrentalsolutions.com. It's a very active forum where there's a lot of people discussing different things about Flex. Last I checked, we had a few thousand different users, 2,300 members. So a lot of times if you ask a question here, you could probably get a response from somebody like our CEO, Chris, or I also know that Randy, Rocky, and Devin are also in here, our support guys. I'll come in here and answer some questions as well. But we also have a lot of people who are just very knowledgeable about Flex that are just normal Flex users. And you can come in here and ask a question and get some ideas from other Flex users. If you're having some more technical issues with your system, then you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.